there's never been any proof that there was any kind of satanic ritual or satanic cult activity in a daycare center.
Today's episode is going to be extremely disturbing, and we cover some of the darkest material we've covered here on the show to date. So get ready for a story of Satan, mind control, ritualized cover-ups, lies, government secrecy, and even murder. This is a story that every American needs to know about, and it's my passion to expose these people. So without further ado, let's do a deep dive into this. And I just want to state outright, I have no intention of if you know what I'm saying. You can also fact check everything that I say in this video using the resources document in the description. And also, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. What we're doing here is reporting on already reported facts and telling you the full story that the government, the US government, doesn't want you to hear. The Presidio Day Care scandal is one of the darkest chapters in American history. It's a tale of satanic rituals, fires, murder, and cover-ups. And it's a story that almost nobody in America knows about. This story is very dark and very disturbing, so viewer discretion, once again, is advised. Before we get into the story of the that occurred at the Presidio, however, we need to talk a little bit about the Presidio complex itself. The Presidio of San Francisco, originally known as El Presidio Real de San Francisco, is a historical park located on the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula. Established in 1776 by New Spain as a fortified settlement, it was created to secure Spanish interests in Alta California and the San Francisco Bay Area. After passing to Mexico in 1820 and then to the United States in 1848, the Presidio served as an active military post for over 2 centuries before being transferred to the National Park Service in 1994 as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. This marked the end of its 219 years of military use and the start of its transition into a public park with both commercial and recreational facilities. In 1996, the U.S. Congress established the Presidio Trust to manage the park's interior land, while the coastal areas remained under the National Park Service's oversight. The trust was tasked with making the Presidio financially self-sufficient by 2013, a goal it achieved by 2005, well ahead of schedule. This unique management structure allowed the park to become a financially sustainable entity while preserving its historical significance. Recognized as a California Historical Landmark in 1933 and a National Historic Landmark in 1962, the Presidio is noted for its natural beauty, with scenic views of the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco Bay, and the Pacific Ocean. Throughout its long military history, the Presidio played a significant role in many U.S. conflicts, particularly in the Pacific Rim. It was the assembly point for the American forces invading the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and served as headquarters for the Western Defense Command during World War II. It was at the Presidio that Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt signed orders for the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942, a decision made under Executive Order 9066. The Presidio also contributed troops to Operation Desert Storm in 1991, marking one of its final military engagements. It was home to the Letterman Army Medical Center, which provided medical care to wounded soldiers through many 20th century conflicts. And that building, before it was demolished, was said to be extremely haunted. Today, the Presidio contains the San Francisco National Cemetery, one of only 2 remaining cemeteries within the city. Among those interred are prominent military figures like General Frederick Funston and General Irvin McDowell. The park also includes a historical walking trail as part of the Trails Forever initiative. This trail features interpretive signage about the area's rich history, including its use as a burial ground for merchant seamen. The Presidio has evolved from a military stronghold to a cherished public space that honors its historical legacy while offering recreational and educational opportunities to visitors. So, back in the day, the Presidio was a powerful place, a location that held significant strength through the United States Army, a place that contained, obviously, many high-level secrets within. Secrets that, slowly but surely, are making their way out from the shadowy fortified walls of the Presidio and into the library of public knowledge. For example, one mysterious event in the Presidio's history was the death of a nuclear scientist. You see, in 1953, the Presidio campus in San Francisco became the setting for a chilling and mysterious event involving William Curtis Twitchell, a brilliant chemist deeply involved in atomic research. Twitchell, born in Minnesota in 1917, had an impressive career with degrees from Rollins College and UC Berkeley. By By 23, he was a project engineer at UC's radiation lab, working alongside future Manhattan Project scientists like Glenn Seaborg, Ernest Lawrence, and J. Robert Oppenheimer. During World War II, their focus shifted to nuclear weapons development, a critical effort for the US military. And eventually, as the Cold War began, William Curtis Twitchell remained an advocate for atomic advancements, including a proposed supercyclotron to reverse atomic bomb processes. But in 1952, Twitchell's promising life took a dark turn when he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. Recognizing the potential risk posed by his declining health, the US government moved him to a newly built secure ward at the Letterman Army Hospital inside of the Presidio, fearing that he might reveal sensitive nuclear secrets as he lost control of his faculties. So essentially, this nuclear scientist was hidden away in a private wing of a hospital specially constructed for him because the government was afraid that if he started getting older and losing his faculties, like I said, he'd spill top secret information. The Atomic Energy Commission spent $100,000, or almost $1 million today, to construct a special ward with restricted access, ensuring only carefully screened medical professional, including one trusted nurse, attended to him. But despite the intense secrecy surrounding his hospitalization, Twitchell's condition became public upon his death on March 23, 1953. And as the news spread around America that a nuclear scientist had been given his own top-secret hospital wing to die in at the Presidio, the Atomic Commission was forced to reveal to the public that similar isolation wards were being used across the country to safeguard nuclear secrets. There were multiple top-secret hospital wards erected for these dying nuclear scientists, wards which were costing the American government millions of dollars. Although the existence of these wards were confirmed by the Commission, the exact locations of the others and the number of locations was never fully revealed or discovered. Eventually, Twitchell's body was returned to Minnesota where he was buried. Although there are no specific ghost stories about Twitchell at the Letterman Hospital, a local legend tells of a mysterious figure boarding a Mooney bus in the Presidio, only to vanish without a trace. Some have speculated that this could be Twitchell, returning from beyond the grave in a final attempt to reach his Berkeley home. So, as you can see, the Presidio itself was no stranger to covering up government secrets or engaging in hush-hush top-secret affairs. But the Presidio was going to be thrust into the national spotlight in the late 1980s when the sordid affair of the Presidio Day Care scandal began to unfold. So I took the following reporting from Linda Goldston, a former reporter for the San Jose Mercury News in California. A lot of this article that I'm reading from essentially is Linda's writing. I've taken a ton of different words and swapped stuff out, moved the structure around, and I've added a ton of new information that's come out since this whole thing was published. But Linda went incredibly in depth with the Presidio story, and like I said, I'm going to present her findings and article. I just absolutely loved the way that Linda told the story and walked people through it. Plus, it's almost the same as how anybody else would tell this story, but this is an excellent summary of the Presidio case. I want to give credit where credit is due. This is all information I had come across in my own independent research before, so I was able to corroborate it. And I'm sure that by the end of this, you're going to be convinced that something sinister was happening on the Presidio campus in the late 1980s. So let's get into this extremely dark and twisted story. Even before Joyce Tobin arrived at the daycare center on November 14, 1986, she suspected that something was wrong. Her neighbor Karen Thomas had just called her up to say that Joyce's 3-year-old son had begged to go home with her when she picked up her own child at the Child Development Center that morning. That's the name that they had for the preschool and daycare center, the Child Development Center. According to her friend Karen, Joyce's son said he didn't want to stay for daycare after his preschool class ended. When Karen told the boy that she couldn't take him with her, Joyce Tobin's son turned to his preschool teacher and asked if he could stay with her, but she had no choice. At the time that she received this news from her friend, Joyce Tobin was at a dentist's office on the other side of town and had arranged for her son to be taken from his preschool class at the Childhood Development Center to hourly care until she could pick him up. Until the boy started preschool 2 months earlier, he had been left at center once or twice a month for a period of 2 years. This was actually only the second time that Joyce's son had been left in hourly care since September of that year, both times while his mother had medical appointments that she couldn't bring him with to. The preschool, like I said, otherwise known as the Child Development Center, and the hourly care programs were both run by the United States Army at the Presidio of San Francisco. And on that day that changed her life forever and the lives of her family, Joyce Tobin arrived at the Presidio Day Care Center at 2:30 p.m. to finally pick up her son. When she entered the child care center, Joyce's son appeared to be napping with several other children, and the teacher, Gary Hambright, was sitting at a table in the room watching over the kids. When Joyce asked how her son had been that day, Gary said the boy had been upset and hadn't eaten his lunch. He called the child a darling little boy and suggested that Joyce bring him to the daycare center every other day so that the boy could get used to him. That's a quote. According to Gary Hambright, a lot of 3 and 4-year-olds had trouble coming to his daycare room. He suggested that they were intimidated by the older children in the class and that they simply had to adjust to being separated from their parents. That night, while watching television with his older brother, Joyce's 3-year-old son started playing with his pulling it forward with both hands up and letting it go. "Mr. Gary, do it," he said, and kept at it. Upon hearing this, the young boy's brother ran to fetch their mother, who was talking to a neighbor in the front doorway. Trying to keep her voice calm, Joyce approached her 3-year-old and asked him what he was talking about. The child's reply was terse and grim. "He touched my with his hand and he bit my," he told his mother. The boy then made a chomping sound with his mouth. Asked if Mr. Gary had done anything else, the boy said, quote, "He put a pencil in my hole in my bum. He do that to me. He hurt me and I cry and cry," end quote. Joyce Tobin in that moment was unsure what to think. "It seemed too impossible and horrible to be true," she said later. "I also thought how awful it would be to accuse someone of this if it were not true." But as she watched her son that evening, he seemed different, anxious, upset. In fact, she watched her young son bite his nails and turn his head away from her. He seemed nervous and disturbed. When Joyce's husband, Captain Mike Tobin, came home, the couple decided to observe their son over the weekend. They agreed they wouldn't question him, but they would indeed wait and listen closely to see if he said anything more. At bedtime, Joyce, who had been trained as a nurse, examined her own son's anus. Immediately, she noticed that it seemed a bit swollen and red. That night, the 3-year-old came to his parents' bedroom crying. He said he was scared. He said he wanted to sleep with them. During the next few days, what had seemed at first too impossible and horrible to be true wouldn't go away. And as both Joyce and Mike tuned in, they listened in horror as their son continued to talk about Mr. Gary hurting him. The following Tuesday, on November 18th, 1986, Joyce Tobin was driving through the Presidio with her son. When they came to the intersection where she would have turned to go to the daycare center, her 3-year-old son raised himself up out of his car seat as if he were attempting to get out and started to cry. "Are you taking me to daycare?" he screamed. "I don't want to go to daycare. Mr. Gary hurt me and I cry." Seeing how distressed her child had become at the concept of being dropped off at the daycare, Joyce reassured him that they were not going to go there, and he calmed down. However, even though her son had settled down, Joyce couldn't. That incident was the final straw that broke the camel's back, and seeing her son react like that, Joyce was convinced that she should contact the daycare center. So, on Wednesday, November 19th, she called the director of the daycare center, a woman named Diana Curl, and asked for an appointment to discuss her son's allegations. But despite the seriousness of the complaint, Diana Curl, the director, said she couldn't see Joyce until Friday, 2 days later, which is shocking. Here you have a mother calling the director of a daycare and alleging that her son was raped by one of the employees, and it seems like she doesn't care. However, within a half hour of the call, Joyce was called at home by one of her son's preschool teachers, who wanted to know what the problem was. Joyce was very confused in that moment. You see, she hadn't told a single employee of the daycare center about the allegations, besides the center's director, Diana Curl, on the phone call. In a bizarre twist, however, it turns out that the entire daycare center staff had been told immediately about Joyce's call and the allegations. Literally, almost immediately after Joyce had spoken with Diana, the director, Diana had phoned up the staff of the center and informed them that these allegations were being made. This was on Wednesday. And bizarrely, authorities who were contacted did not search the center until Friday. This would have given any predator employees ample time to clear out any evidence that they held within the walls of the daycare center. Joyce Tobin never got the meeting that she had wanted with Diana Curl. The case broke before then. On Thursday, November 20th, Mike Tobin spoke with the chaplain at the Presidio and informed the chaplain of his son's allegations, and the chaplain then contacted the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Officers from the CID, or Criminal Investigation Division, then acted immediately and made an appointment to interview and videotape the boy about his allegations. And this is what really kicked this whole thing off. On the morning of November 21st, the Tobin son was interviewed by officers from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division in a videotaped session. He was then afterwards examined at the Child Adolescent Referral Center, or CASARC, at the San Francisco General Hospital. CASARC reviews more than 700 cases of suspected sexual abuse every single year. Among other things, the CASARC staff had often heard children describe as having a pencil put in their bottoms, just like the Tobin son had described it. In fact, they had heard children describe rape with this pencil analogy so many times that it had practically become common knowledge as to what it meant amongst the group members. And when Dr. Kevin Coulter examined the Tobin son, he observed that the child's dilated to approximately 20 millimeters in approximately 5 seconds, a much faster and wider dilation than normal. Dr. Kevin Coulter had conducted more than 300 examinations of children at CASARC throughout his time spent as a medical provider there. He had seen children that had been raped before and had analyzed every inch of their bodies to find confirming evidence of these crimes. His conclusion that day was that such rapid and wide dilation was caused by trauma to the and consistent with. It turned out that the child hadn't been lying. Dr. Kevin Coulter then informed the parents that, after their examination, he had determined that their 3-year-old son had been sexually abused and raped. A flurry of meetings at the Presidio followed the revelation that the Tobin boy had been abused. Secret meetings, many undocumented and informal. But even with all this activity, these meetings in boardrooms and in buildings across the campus, the Army seemed to be in no hurry to proceed with the sexual abuse case. In fact, it took the Army 12 days to form a strategy group and to really begin investigating. And it took the Army almost an entire month to notify the parents of other children who had been in Mr. Gary's class that a student in their classroom had allegedly been raped by the teacher and that their own children might be at risk. Nearly a year would pass before more than 59 other victims, children between the ages of 3 and 7, had been identified. And allegations would be made by parents that several more children were even after the investigation had begun. Usually, when allegations of rape and sexual abuse are made against the caregivers and employees of a childhood daycare center, the center shuts down. And keep in mind, this wasn't just an average daycare center ran by private United States citizens. This was the Childhood Development Center and Daycare at the Presidio, under the care of the United States Army. And this complicates things even further. You see, daycare centers under state jurisdiction, like the Child Development Center, are routinely closed when an incident is confirmed. But the Presidio Center stayed open for more than a year after the Tobin son said that Mr. Gary had raped him. A strategy meeting on December 10th set the tone for the case. The meeting was attended by all of the brass from the Presidio, representatives of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and staff from the Child Adolescent Sexual Abuse Referral Center. The CASARC workers told the Army to expect multiple victims, so many victims that they couldn't even offer their help. But the Army didn't want to believe that. That's a quote, says one CASARC worker who attended the meeting. 5 days later, on December 15th, letters were mailed to 242 parents whose children were in Hambright's classes. The letter said, "The commander of the Presidio of San Francisco has been apprised of a single incident of alleged child abuse reported to have occurred at the Presidio Child Development Center. We have no reason to believe that other children have been victimized." End quote. Many parents who received that letter took the Army at its word. Many of them didn't learn until the following April, after the Tobins and other parents forced the Army to send out another letter, informing parents that their children may have been victims. Other parents found out right away and had known for a while. That's because the children had already begun to talk before these letters were sent out, before this was a known issue. And these kids kept talking. That was the problem. They kept saying things that no one, especially not the Army, wanted to hear. Other children, not the Tobin son, kept mentioning people besides Mr. Gary, other locations besides the daycare center. Here are a few of the allegations the other children began to make. Some of the children said they were taken from the daycare center to private homes on the Presidio campus where they were abused by multiple people. 2 houses were singled out on the Army post and at least 1 home off post in San Francisco. One girl said she played poo-poo baseball at the home of one of her female teachers. The young girl said the game involved throwing fresh feces at the teacher. Other children talked about playing the goo-goo game with Mr. Gary. It involved Gary Hambright allegedly having the children and on him. Then he would do the same to them. Sometimes the children said they were forced to drink urine and eat feces. Some even said they had blood smeared on their bodies. And other children said they had guns pointed at them. Some of the victims even claimed they were told they or their parents would be hurt or killed if they told anybody what happened. One 3-year-old boy said he was sexually abused on his first visit to the daycare center. That day also happened to be his birthday. A 3-year-old girl said Mr. Gary used special pens, black, blue, pink, and red, to doodle on her body, starting at her legs and moving up over her The same child said she saw one of her friends at the center cry when Mr. Gary's friend, a woman, pointed a gun at the friend. There were also, and this is a big part of this, 5 confirmed cases of chlamydia, a sexually transmitted disease, found in the children. That's right, there were 5 children that were making accusations that were all diagnosed with chlamydia, including 2 of the 4 daughters of one family. And the Army has been very secretive about these tests. We still don't know the extent of the testing, who tested positive for what, how many kids were even tested. People have tried to get that information and they just refuse to release it. And a preliminary test for one boy for AIDS ended up coming back positive. Further tests, though, revealed that he didn't have the disease, but fear of AIDS tormented parents for months. Now, these allegations were already horrific. These kids were all independently reporting their to their parents, going into graphic detail, but for some people, allegations alone aren't enough. In my mind, and in the minds of many others, allegations made by children should always be taken seriously. But these weren't just allegations. A major discovery was about to be made. So as you can see, this whole affair was brewing into a fever pitch. Dozens of children were reporting graphic details of sexual assaults, torture, and bizarre cult-like behaviors. Children were being diagnosed with STDs, and doctors were confirming that it appeared they had indeed been abused, but the worst was yet to come. You see, despite these rumors and allegations, the Army, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office were united in wanting one thing: a simple, single predator case. The Army, as always with these sorts of things, wanted the matter over with as quickly and quietly as possible. And the prosecutors involved wanted a case that they knew they would win. I'll even go a step further and posit that the powers that be that were involved in this whole thing wanted a scapegoat for the affair. A singular person that they could pin all of this and all of these disgusting allegations on. In the mind of the prosecution, the more unusual the allegations that they attempted to prosecute, the harder it would be to win in court. So, a lot of these children's testimonies they didn't think were good enough to use. And in addition, if they were to entertain the allegations of fecal consumption and gunplay, then that would be a sort of admission that these sorts of things were actually possible. And that's something the government obviously doesn't want to admit to. So on January 5th, 1987, Gary Willard Hambright, Mr. Gary, was arrested. Gary Hambright, 35 years old, was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. After Gary moved to the Bay Area of San Francisco in 1977 from his home in Tacoma, Washington, he worked as a substitute teacher in the San Francisco School District before taking the $7.59 per hour job at the Child Development Center on the Presidio campus in 1985. At his eventual arraignment, Gary described himself openly as an educator, not a criminal. His close friend, Gordon Grover, a beauty salon owner, said that the thin, pale man with blonde hair, aka Gary, was, quote, probably one of the most gentle people you will ever know, end quote. He's always got time to give kids a hug when they're crying, Grover was quoted as saying at the time. He's just a really kind person. After he was arrested, Gary got out on bond and took part-time jobs cleaning houses and washing windows in order to pay off his mounting legal bills and day-to-day expenses. While facing the most horrific of charges, Gary stayed with his friends on couches and in spare bedrooms, and continued to be closely associated with the Dolores Street Baptist Church in San Francisco. The indictment that Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Gray had sought from the grand jury charged Gary Hambright with only one child. In the actual documents, he was accused of and committing a lewd and lascivious act on a child. In March, 3 months after Gary Hambright's arrest, all of the aforementioned charges were dismissed. At the time, and in the press, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer, who was overseeing the case, stated that he refused to allow the admission of so-called hearsay statements, specifically the comments that Tobin's 3-year-old son made to his brother and mother, and to the nurse and the doctor who examined him about the abuse. Several states allow exceptions of the hearsay rules in child abuse cases, but federal courts and California state courts do not. Furthermore, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer refused the hearsay evidence on March 4th and ruled that the Tobin's son would not qualify as a competent witness because of his age. Essentially, this ruling, at least in my mind, states that a child cannot be a witness to a crime against them. This is not only a major slap in the face to all victims of childhood sexual abuse, but a direct slap in the face of justice as well. On March 20th, 1987, the U.S. Attorney's Office asked that the charges against Gary Hambright be dismissed without prejudice, meaning that he could possibly be retried if new evidence ever emerged. Prosecutor Susan Gray, at the time, directly informed the judge that she was aware of at least 12 more children that were claiming very similar things had happened to them at the hands of Mr. Gary. She informed him that not only were these allegations similar, but they mentioned the same perpetrator that the Tobin son had mentioned, and mentioned similar patterns and methods of Prosecutor Susan Gray, as it turned out, had counted on the fact that the judge would allow the admission of statements that the Tobin son made to his brother on the day he first said Mr. Gary hurt him, as well as the similar comments he made to the nurse and doctor who examined him and to the agents that interviewed him afterwards. The medical evidence and the perfect witness parents had made her even more confident when she was building this case, and she felt pretty confident that she'd be able to get a conviction. That's because Joyce Tobin herself, the boy's mother, was a nurse. Mike Tobin was a West Point graduate and a nuclear engineer. They had no reason to lie or fabricate these things, and it also added more validity to the examination of the boy's. But the Army's supposed independent and thorough investigation of the Tobin son's allegations had gotten off to a shaky start when Army Criminal Investigative Special Agent Mark Remsen was assigned to interview the child. As it turned out, Special Agent Mark Remsen had never interviewed a child younger than 8 years old, and while Army regulations required that the interview be taped, Remsen had never used a videotaping device while conducting an interview either. This seems like he was the first, it seems like this is this guy's first day of work when you really think about it. I mean, he's completely inexperienced on every single facet that he should be experienced in. The regulation was later changed, but the damage had already been done. The videotape in question was to be singled out repeatedly as an example of how the children had supposedly been coached and prodded to tell their stories. That was the narrative that was already being concocted, that these children were somehow coached to tell these fantastical, incredibly disturbing stories. For what reason exactly it was being alleged that these children were being coached, we still don't know. That's something that we always see too, that, oh, these allegations like this, these parents must have been putting these ideas in these children's heads, or these investigators must have been doing this. I understand that, has happened sometimes in the past. But I mean, a case like this, when you've got all these different children with corroborating evidence, corroborating each other's stories, talking to their parents and their doctors and their therapists who are interviewing them, giving the exact same details, and medical records confirming it, it just doesn't make sense. Joyce Tobin, the boy's mother, according to court records, said that during the interview, quote, "Apparently, in an attempt to establish rapport with my son, the CID investigator said that Mr. Gary was bad and should be spanked. He said this numerous times. Thereafter, in the week that followed when my son spoke about Mr. Gary, he described Mr. Gary as bad and said he should be spanked. Prior to the CID interview, my son had never said anything like that or attempted to make any value judgment about what had happened to him. He just reported what had happened to him," Joyce Tobin told the prosecution, and this was just the very beginning of the cover-up. Now, we can view this situation in different ways. Maybe, in a skeptic's mind, the investigator really was just inexperienced and said the wrong things at the wrong time. It's indeed plausible, I'll give you that. However, when you consider every other piece of evidence in this case, this behavior seems to paint a bit of a darker picture. Was that investigator attempting to plant false evidence in the child's mind so that later on investigators and officials could take a look at the child's testimony and throw it out, based simply on the fact that the kid was repeating lies that the investigator had planted in his own already traumatized mind? It's a tactic that's definitely been used before that I can guarantee you will continue to be used in the future. It's something that we've seen in cases like the Elms Guesthouse case in England that we're going to be investigating here on the channel soon, where false evidence was introduced into a case by the authorities in order to get the legitimate evidence questioned, thrown out, and delegitimized. But that's just food for thought. Let's get back to the story. With the charges dismissed at this point, Susan Gray's attempt at securing a simple single conviction had failed, and for a while the case went cold. No further developments emerged, and no authorities acted to try and find justice in this affair. The courts would not hear of the Presidio again until the end of September 1987. Nearly a year after the first allegations were made. Throughout that year, the Tobins were disappointed, but they weren't defeated. In that almost year's time, they had begun calling and writing congressmen, attempting to make noise about the that they in their heart of hearts knew had happened to their son, calling and meeting with Army officials at the Presidio itself. By April of 1987, another battle had shaped up outside of the courtrooms, and this was a pretty disturbing development. Instead of actively trying to investigate the alleged that occurred on the Presidio campus, the Army instead had begun insisting that their daycare center was safe, that all the victims had been identified, and that the issue was already solved. But parents who had children enrolled in the daycare and preschool feared otherwise, because they knew that their own children had mentioned people other than Gary Hambright, people who still worked at the daycare center, as being involved in the At first, it was just the Tobins alone who kept asking, were proper procedures followed? Was everything necessary really done? Did you check on that? What about the other children? But by April of that year, the Tobins had been joined by other families whose kids claimed they were abused. Families like the Runyons, the Adams-Thompsons, the Dorseys, the Foxes. Most of these people had never met before, but they were to meet many times in the months to come. A massive scandal was brewing. The first priority of all these families was to get another letter mailed to the parents of other children who had attended the daycare center, who they felt like the Army and US government had let down and endangered. But the Army saw no need for that. Why are you doing this? Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, the Director of Personnel and Community Activities, asked Mike Tobin. Because parents need to know what's happening, Mike told him during a conversation. That very letter that these concerned families played a part in getting sent out was delayed for 2 more weeks, while Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer argued over whether the number of victims mentioned in the letter should be 32 or 37. 2 weeks for an issue like that? Come on, issues like this need to be acted upon immediately. When Joyce Tobin and fellow victim's mother Brenda Fox went to Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer's office to discuss the finishing and sending of the letter, Meyer told them that he didn't have time to talk, Fox recalls, and she also claimed that he told the 2 mothers that he was on his way to make a videotape about the CDC, about it being a model daycare center. So this powerful military guy didn't have time to talk to the family members of victims, and instead he was prioritizing heading to go film a video about how good and perfect and not scandalous the daycare is. When at the exact same moment, he actually had 2 mothers trying to talk to him whose children were there. Doesn't really make sense. But according to Brenda Fox, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, during that interaction said, "Despite what you may believe, this is a model daycare center." She later said, "I sat there thinking, this man has no soul. We told him the numbers were wrong. He said, no, they're not. We waited while he called and found out the numbers were wrong." Under the signatures of Joyce and Mike Tobin, Gretchen and Dennis Runyon, Sue and Tom Dorsey, Michelle and Larry Adams Thompson, and Brenda and Don Fox, this letter, dated April 29, 1987, was mailed to parents. "We feel you should know that there are now 37 children identified by the authorities as suspected victims," the letter said in part. "We are very concerned that there may be more children affected and in need of help, yet remain unidentified. These parents and families of suspected victims came from all walks of life and all sorts of different backgrounds. The core group of parents at the center of the affair consisted of professionals, doctors, a dentist, a nuclear scientist. They spoke out loud and often, and raised their voices when they needed to. Whenever speaking to the media, the parents claimed they spoke for those who could not, the children and the enlisted people who, they said, were too afraid to risk their military career to speak out about what really happened on the Presidio campus. To them, the only explanation for the silence from all the enlisted people was the fact that they needed their jobs, and that many families, parents, and employees needed that daycare. However, the core group could afford daycare elsewhere. When it first started, they had the chance to be heroes, Melanie Thompson, a parent of one of the victims, once said about the Army. Instead, they just didn't want to believe it. Now they're just trying to cover it up like a bad dream. But as time wore on and more dark truths came to light, this story just kept diving down and down, further and further towards hell. Now, here's something fun. None of the parents who were protesting the Army's handling of the case knew that the signs of trouble had begun to surface at the Child Development Center at least 6 years earlier. And none of these parents knew that the Army had been dealing with problems at its daycare centers for years before the Presidio case broke. When the first allegations broke and concerns arose, the Army said nothing about the prior cases of documented child sex abuse at West Point and Fort Dix. The Army said nothing of an investigation 6 years prior involving John Gunnerson, the Presidio's top daycare official and the supervisor of the daycare center during the time that Gary Hambright allegedly the children. But let's go back in time for a second. In 1982, years before the first allegations were brought forward with the children of the Presidio, a man named John Gunnerson was employed in a somewhat powerful position at the Presidio. His official job title was Child Support Services Coordinator at the Childhood Development Center, responsible for the training of the center's staff. And he was, according to many, a caring, normal man. However, when he was arrested on charges of assaulting an employee of the center, Pearl Broadnax, the opinions of John Gunnarsson on the base suddenly shifted. Pearl Broadnax herself had been complaining about conditions at the center and the allegedly deplorable treatment of the children that she witnessed while working there. She claimed that she was branded a troublemaker and was often brought in, questioned, and grilled by her supervisors about her allegedly unsatisfactory job performance. But this whole thing took a dark turn on February 3rd, 1982, when Pearl and Gunnarsson argued over the use of scissors by the children. According to Pearl, John asked her to go into another room to continue the discussion, but Pearl said she wanted to remain in the playroom. At this time, according to an investigative report of the incident, Gunnarsson grabbed Broadnax by the left arm above her waist and pulled her towards him. She then told Gunnarsson, "Don't touch me," to which he replied, "I'm not touching you." She felt that she was in fear of bodily harm at this point in the incident. And when officially questioned, John Gunnarsson declined to be interviewed about the incident, but responded to questions through Presidio spokesman Bob Mahoney. "I did not grab Mrs. Broadnax, I did not assault her, and I had no intention of harming her," he related to Mahoney. In the course of our conversation, Mrs. Broadnax became agitated and appeared to be losing control of herself. I attempted to calm her by lightly touching her arm to guide her out from the room where we were talking. At least, that's what John Gunnarsson claimed happened. Unsurprisingly, the charge against John Gunnarsson was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. The incident could possibly be dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, except that the ensuing investigation at the time led to more allegations of physical and sexual abuse of children at the same center, according to former military police investigator Ed Albanoski, who was then the chief of juvenile investigations at the Presidio. It seemed like a can of worms had suddenly been opened. Eventually graduating from the Presidio to the title of deputy sheriff in Santa Clara County, Ed Albanoski called the original author of this article Linda Goldston after he read one of her stories about the Presidio case. "When I read the paper, I almost fell out of my chair," he said. "I couldn't believe Gunnarsson was still working there." While interviewing Pearl at the daycare center after she had called military police officers about Gunnarsson, Ed learned that Pearl was concerned about more than just the alleged threat of harm to herself. She also alleged that employees had touched children's improperly. Pearl had provoked an investigation of the center a year earlier, after talking to parents who said they felt their children were discriminated against because they were minorities. Pearl also said in a documented accusation that she had seen the then director of the center hit a child in the mouth, an injury which caused him to bleed. In a telephone interview from her home in Alabama, Pearl told Linda, the author of the original article, that she had complained many times about the problems at the center during the 4 years she worked there, but, quote, "just gave up. Nobody seemed to be concerned. I ended up having a nervous breakdown over that," end quote. She was quoted as saying, "Right before I left, I saw a woman beat a kid until he just threw up," she said. "I did all I could to get something done about that. They removed her, but she was back working there after I left." After Pearl made her thoughts and initial observations and allegations known, Captain Robert J. Meyer was appointed to look into the allegations for the commander of the Presidio. And once again, we'll see a similar pattern here of ignoring issues, allowing problems to fester, and covering up horrific misdeeds. You see, in a letter summarizing his findings, Captain Robert J. Myers said, "At least 3 of the child care center staff have been threatened with the loss of their jobs if they speak out and tell the truth about how the child care center is being managed and how the minority children are treated." After this letter was finished and published, a hearing was held at the Presidio about these allegations in the year 1981. The director in question was placed on leave for a brief moment before being reinstated, and it seemed as if life went right back to normal. All of those allegations were forgotten about, uninvestigated. The physical, the children getting smacked, the other adults and teachers playing with children's. It's almost like that stuff never happened. And so the next year, when Ed Albanoski reported the sex abuse allegations that he had heard to Presidio officials, he was told, quote, "To stop any investigation, I was told there was nothing to look into, that Gunnarsson would be dealt with through his command channels," end quote. Military police investigators report number 0019382 MP 1026 82047, dated February 4th, 1982, was filed on the incident. Ed Albanoski, after all these years, still holds on to a copy of that report. He sensed back then that it might be important someday. And thank God he did that, because the Army didn't take this whole thing quite as seriously. This particular case was not known to any of us in the chain of command. Presidio Commander Joseph V. Rafferty said when questioned about those older allegations, "Mr. Gunnarsson had one of the finest reputations in the Army with respect to running a child care center." Bizarre, very bizarre to defend a guy accused of physical assault against an employee and sexual assault against children. But a year after he was arrested, John Gunnarsson was cited in an inspection report by officials from the U.S. Army Forces Command for doing an excellent job as the Child Support Services Coordinator. The staff training program he developed utilizing the military child care modules is model for the Army. This glowing praise was showered onto John Gunnarsson just a little over a year after he was accused of physically abusing an employee, physically abusing children, and either taking part in, or at minimum turning a blind eye to the sexual abuse of children there. But even though the Army wasn't listening to them or paying attention, these allegations of abuse at the daycare center would continue to surface. In a somewhat notorious incident, former Army Captain Gary Boswell approached John Gunnarsson in April 1985 after picking up his daughter at the daycare center. She had a red spot on her hand where she had been burned, she said. The teacher burned me. This girl was taking the kids and taking a magnifying glass and holding their hands until they jerked their hand away and cried, said Boswell. I went to see Gunnarsson and wasn't terribly pleased. He said he'd look into it. We came back the next day and he said he had talked to the person, that there were no eyewitnesses, and it's your daughter's word against hers, so we can't do anything. We took our daughter out of the daycare center a short time later. So, according to another independent witness, this female teacher was taking children's hands, putting them under a magnifying glass and burning them. And then, when presented with the child and the injury and the allegations, the director of the center takes no action against the employee and just says, oh, we don't believe the girl. Weird. Then, a year or so later, a mother named Sue Dorsey contacted John Gunnarsson in June of 1986 to complain about a sexual incident she says she witnessed with her own two eyes at the center. Sue Dorsey, the wife of Army Captain Tom Dorsey, a physician, said she had just dropped her daughter off at the daycare center and was walking out of the building when she noticed, quote, a woman on her hands and knees, bent over, putting her hands in a little girl's. The woman took her hands out from the little girl's and put them under the little girl's and tickled her on both and then went back down into the vaginal area and tickled her there, end quote. Now obviously this is something really disturbing to see with your own two eyes, and Sue knew that whatever the hell she just saw, that it was not right. But after relating the incident to the assistant director of the center, Sue said she was told a similar story to the other similar stories that other concerned parents and employees were told over the years. Sue was told that the grown adult woman that she had seen the little girl in was just playing innocent tickling games. But Sue Dorsey wasn't satisfied with this response, so she then went to John Gunnarsson, who, she says, replied, so what you're telling me is that she tickled the little girl on her parts. After this conversation, according to Sue, she then returned home and called Gunnarsson later in the day. He said, I'm going to write something up in her personnel file. But once again, Sue felt that this wasn't enough action. Finally, after further calls to the captain who supervised the civilian employees at the center, Sue got some good news. She was told that the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, would investigate the case. But Colonel Rafferty would later comment on the investigation, saying that it proved that it could not be substantiated that any abuse had occurred. From my understanding of the actual involved, there was a question of just exactly what was clearly a tickling type of incident that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. I suspect the investigators took the caregiver's interpretation of what it was. After all that effort, after trying to raise the alarm that was occurring at the Presidio for months, Sue Dorsey had gotten nowhere. She was told time and time again that this would be all looked into, that some sort of action would be taken, but nothing ever happened. Time and time again, these investigations and investigators claimed, yeah, we looked at it, but we're just going to believe the perpetrator. Screw the victim. We don't care about what they're saying. Sue Dorsey was defeated. And a year later, Sue Dorsey learned that her own daughter had been abused while at the Presidio Child Care Center. Sue Dorsey and the other parents would also learn that there had been abuse cases involving daycare centers at several other Army bases across the U.S. Cases of that were hidden from the mainstream media and in a way covered up. One of the most serious cases of child sex abuse occurred at West Point, that is, until the Presidio. In July 1984, a 3-year-old girl was brought to the emergency room at the West Point Hospital with a lacerated. The child at the time told the doctor who examined her that a teacher at the West Point Daycare Center was the one who hurt her, that a teacher was the one who had damaged her private area. In August of 1984, at West Point, another parent came forward. By the end of the year, 50 children had been interviewed by investigators. Starting to sound familiar? Well, the similarities do not end there. The children at West Point, years prior to the emergence of the stories of the children at the Presidio, told stories that would, in time, become horrifyingly familiar. The children said that they had been ritually abused. They said that they had excrement smeared on their bodies and had been forced to eat feces and drink urine. They also said they were taken away from the daycare center and photographed while they were being. And these children also said that they were told if they ever told anyone anything about what was happening to them, either they or their families would be killed. Sounds exactly like the allegations from the Presidio. Some parents at the time alleged that they believed the Army had tried its best to cover up these cases. The whole underlying theme was that the image of West Point was more important than dealing with the reality of what happened, said Dr. Walter Grote, whose 2-year-old daughter was among the children allegedly abused at the center.
This is Dr. Walter Grote, would you stand, sir? Whose daughter was allegedly abused at West Point, the United States Military Academy. You were a captain in the United States Army. Aside from what allegedly happened to your daughter, which I know you allege was part of a satanic cult, and having nothing to do with this man, I state again for the record. What is your feeling, sir, on the fact that a serving officer in the United States Army is also a professed Satanist, a high-ranking person?
Well, I think in this election year, we've heard a lot about values, Geraldo. We've heard a lot that our little children should be saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Mr. Aquino has identified himself as an antichrist. He preaches that as the leader of the Temple Set. I don't think I'm misquoting him. I find it inconceivable that we can have candidates talking about one nation under God and having our children say that, yet by the same token, we can have somebody in our army as a colonel leading our troops in battle who are opposed to the very concept of God and whose whole purpose it is to fight against God.
At the time that the article about this was written, Dr. Walter Grote had moved on and moved to a different state where he had a private medical practice in New Jersey. A former Army captain, Dr. Walter Grote actually turned down a promotion to major in 1984 to protest the Army's handling of the daycare case at West Point. He was, once again, just like the other parents, well aware that the problem at the point had started long before. In August of 1983, nearly a year before the case broke out at West Point, a 22-month-old child had been murdered by the mother's boyfriend, an Army staff sergeant. After a court-martial hearing, the sergeant was given an 18-month suspended sentence and dishonorable discharge. Yes, you heard that correctly. A man had murdered his girlfriend's 22-month-old child and was given no prison time. Colonel Richard C. Eckert, a doctor that was then in charge of West Point's child protection case management team, was outraged at the leniency of the sentence. I mean, seriously, who in their right mind wouldn't be? In an August 1st, 1983 letter to Lieutenant General Willard Scott Jr., the then superintendent of West Point, Colonel Richard Eckert wrote, "The community has received a devastating message. West Point and the Army take child lightly and do not consider it a major offense." Yes, those words are in writing. And yes, those words rang true. The guy that murdered the 22-month-old baby was let off scot-free, said Dr. Pat Jones, a former pediatrician at West Point who moved away from the area and eventually opened up a private practice in Texas. They just kicked him out of the Army to prevent any publicity. Dr. Pat Jones, who believes his 15-month-old daughter was beat at the center at West Point, was so outraged that he resigned from the Army. "I tried to resign from the Alumni Association. I feel ashamed for even being from that place," he was quoted as saying. But once again, at the end of the day, no indictments were returned in the West Point cases. Not a single adult was held liable for the abuse of dozens of children, and nothing came out of it, even though everyone involved, mainly the victims' families, knew that all of this was true and very real. No justice was served. Fort Dix was next. In July of 1986, 2 female employees were accused of sexually abusing 4 3-year-old girls on the Fort Dix campus. But once again, we see a similar pattern and start to hear a similar story here. No indictments were returned in the case, and the women returned to work at the same daycare center. I don't know why they just keep letting these predators keep returning to work, but they did. Then it was Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and after that, Fort Jackson, South Carolina. By November 1987, the Army had received allegations of child abuse at 15 of its daycare centers and several elementary schools. This seemed to be an epidemic. There were also at least 2 cases of reported child sexual abuse in Air Force daycare centers as well, and at a daycare center run by the Navy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In that case, a civilian was sentenced to 3 years in prison for children. This was one of the only cases where the allegations were investigated seriously, and the affair ended with a conviction. So, seeing all of these problems arising, the Department of Defense decided in April of 1987, in the middle of the Presidio scandal, to form special strike teams to investigate cases in the military. The goal of the teams is to not let things get any worse. said Bob Steen, director of the Military Family Resource Center at the Department of Defense at the time that the original article was written. We need to be better prepared to deal with the magnitude of the problem. I don't think anybody was prepared at the Presidio or West Point, he claimed. But despite the military's official stance of preparedness, a new horror surfaced in June 1988 when a special team of experts was sent to Panama to help determine if as many as 10 children at a Department of Defense elementary school had been molested and possibly infected with AIDS by a teacher who was, at the time, dying of the disease. Interestingly enough, right now, in the year 2024, when I attempted to research that case of the Department of Defense elementary school in Panama, I couldn't find any information online relating to the affair. I don't even know what ended up happening, or if there ever was any conclusion to this story or these claims. But after hearing all that, you can see that these things were happening all across America, tied in directly to the Army or Navy, and nothing was being done about it. They were very similar, and these claims were all ignored and shut down. But let's get back to the Presidio. Although the allegations of ritual abuse made by children at West Point and at the Presidio were similar, we may never totally resolve whether there is any kind of external organization of abuse, or if just a single was involved in those cases, said Colonel Jim Schley, Deputy Director of the Military Family Resource Center. But some of the allegations made by children at the Presidio, that they were taken to houses on and off post by men and women, led to an investigation of the possibility that there was an external organization in San Francisco, a ring of sorts that was operating with the darkest and most disturbing of intentions. So let's talk about that. This is where the devil comes to play.
As sickening and unbelievable as it sounds, bearing children for use in satanic rituals may really be happening.
My daughter, who I named Wendy, was sacrificed at birth with an upside-down cross and then taken outside and buried. My son, they kept and let live till 2 years old, and then he was sacrificed.
Michael and I had a son, and he was dedicated to Satan at birth, and at 6 months of age, he was sacrificed to Satan.
It is most common for the heart to be taken from the child and offered to Satan.
These women say they speak from personal experience. They claim to be breeders, forced by covens to bear children, both as a way for the cults to get new members and to find fresh victims for ritual murder.
Did you give birth to infants who were sacrificed?
My first two
were sacrificed.
were sacrificed. I was told it was the highest honor I could ever do as a woman, was to sacrifice my first two.
And you did that?
I was so brainwashed, I believed their philosophy.
Jackie tells us she was able to escape her satanic cult. Today she helps other women, like Donna, who are trying to break free.
You killed your babies?
Take the skin off.
You skin the baby? You take the baby's skin off? Do you feel remorse? Have you told the police?
I had to do what I had to do, or I'd be killed like the babies that they made me watch killed, and that they put in my hand. They said, "Obey, or this is you."
Jackie, you have some pictures drawn during the therapy sessions by the people who've been through this. Why don't you show me some of them?
This picture is a person remembering skinning children and babies and hanging it out to dry. And
Skinning?
Skinning them, taking the skin off alive while they are alive, and skin them until they die.
And that's how your babies died?
They took a little patch about 3 by 4 off of her stomach, skinned her, and said, "We'll skin you all the way if you talk or cry." You learn not to cry real fast.
I don't cry.
In the 1980s, you see, the Presidio wasn't the nice, refurbished, posh area that it is today. All across the campus, there sat abandoned buildings and shacks that littered the landscapes, structures reminiscent of a time when the campus saw a lot more action. And inside a concrete bunker behind the military intelligence building at the Presidio, the words "Prince of Darkness" were painted boldly in red on one wall. Used decades ago to house artillery guns, the reinforced concrete batteries appeared to have been converted to something like ritual chambers. I'm also going to note that at the time that this article was written, in the middle of 1988, these structures were still standing on the Presidio campus. As of today, they are gone. This abandoned bunker complex would go on to be a key part of the story. You see, emblazoned next to the Prince of Darkness graffiti inside of that abandoned bunker was the word "die" and what looked like a list of names painted in red that had been crossed out with heavy black paint. One wall was covered with the numerals 666, a sign of the devil, and occult drawings. There was also a clearing in the center of the concrete floor, where where the ground was exposed, that was filled with refuse and partly burned logs. On the front wall beneath the window that faced the military intelligence building was a huge, expertly painted pentagram inside of a circle. And in the rear, where the sunlight gave way to darkness, white and black candle drippings sat atop a dome-shaped recession in the wall, apparently a crude sort of altar. Incense sticks were also found inside of this abandoned bunker, half burned to the side. So people on the Presidio campus discovered this completely creepy abandoned satanic bunker, thought nothing of it. At another abandoned battery farther up Lincoln Boulevard, a large drawing of Satan with red eyes and horns appeared one night on an outside concrete wall. Doors to the battery at the time were supposedly secured shut. There were no windows to climb through, and no entry was possible there.
Joseph, we've agreed to conceal your identity, but you are an officer in the United States Army.
That's correct.
And you were an officer in the United States Army during the time you were a member of this satanic organization.
Yes.
Did the authorities at the Presidio know that a satanic organization was active on their base during the time that you were a member?
They were very much aware of it, yes.
The present base commander, Colonel Rafferty, says that today at least,
I know of no satanic activities whatsoever in this area.
Satanism may be a constitutionally protected religion, but similar to another recent case at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Here, charges surface connecting ritual child at the Presidio Day Care Center to the devil cult. It was here, parents and others allege, that as many as 60 young children were ritualistically by soldiers of Satan.
It'd be easy to dismiss the satanic graffiti as the pranks of adolescents, taking advantage of the isolated bunkers to scare their friends, or the people on the Presidio campus. But the events in the Presidio case suggested something more sinister could have been involved. When you dig into the history of the campus, one discovers that satanic goings-on were not new to the Presidio. In the early 1980s, when he was an MP or military police at the Presidio, that former officer, Ed Albanoski, recalled, quote, "We got a call from the Portola MacArthur housing area. One person reported a man dressed in black holding a little girl's hand running toward the park. Another call came in saying they heard screams near the creek." End quote. The search led to a gardener's shack at Julius Kahn Park, a strip of city-owned playground adjacent to the Presidio, behind the housing area. "We heard noise coming from the inside," Ed recalled. "We kicked the door open, and here's this nice little bedroom. In a corner was a mannequin with a gun aimed at the door. On the left, there was this bunk against the wall. There was a pentagram on the floor, a huge one. There were dolls' heads all over the ceiling. Just off-the-wall stuff," end quote. When the bunker was searched, loud music was found playing through a radio. After chasing this hooded figure that was seen running around with a little girl and finding this bizarre horror shack, Ed Albanoski and another MP were given approval to set up a surveillance around the structure. But after a while, the investigation was called off. "We were sitting there, we've got a cult on the Presidio of San Francisco, and nobody cares about it," Ed Albanoski said. "We were told by the provost marshal to just forget about it." Though Ed's investigation went nowhere, the child abuse cases would raise the specter of Satanism again.
Indeed, the Army does officially recognize Satanism as a legitimate religion and supplies chaplains with this guide for ministering to the satanic soldier. Yet unofficially, some charge that Army bases have become sanctuaries for devil worshippers. Just last month, under a full moon, I took a midnight tour of the Presidio grounds with police investigator Ed Abanovsky. Are you saying that there was a satanic cult active right here on the Army base?
Yes, we believe so. There's evidence to substantiate that. They had satanic rituals going on. There's an altar in there, and all of the graffiti on the wall would indicate that.
Let's see if I can see it. How'd you find this place?
This is a fortification during World War II. During World War II, where they had gun batteries.
I can see a pentagram painted on the wall. I can see the words Prince of Darkness. On this wall, I see several inverted crosses and other obvious satanic ritualistic paintings or symbols. What actually was done to the kids?
Defecation. They were urinated on.
The former chief juvenile investigator at the Presidio, Ed Abanovsky, is here. He's now a deputy sheriff in Santa Clara County.
Larry and Michelle Adams Thompson had noticed changes in their daughter's behavior after placing her in Gary Hambright's class 4 or 5 times in September and October of 1986. Their daughter, who turned 3 in October, had begun having nightmares and would wet herself when frightened. Her parents believed it was just a bad stage she was going through until they heard about the Tobin son in January and learned of the allegations of abuse in the daycare center. After learning of the allegations, Larry and Michelle's daughter was taken to a therapist at Letterman Army Medical Center in February 1987. In therapy, the girl talked about being sexually abused by Gary Hambright, and also by a man named Mikey and a woman named Shambi, whose identities were unknown. This is where it gets unbelievably freaky. On August 12, 1987, the Adams Thompsons were shopping at the PX, or Post Exchange store at the Presidio. Suddenly, the little girl ran to Larry Adams Thompson, her father, and clutched his leg. And when Larry looked up, he saw a man who he knew as one of the most powerful people on the Presidio base, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. "Yes, that's Mikey," the 3-year-old told her father. After being taken outside, the girl added, "He's a bad man, and I'm afraid." As they were leaving the parking lot, the Adams Thompsons saw Aquino's wife, a woman named Lilith. Larry then asked his daughter if she knew the woman. "Yes, that's Shambi," the girl said. Immediately after this, the family went home and called the FBI. When interviewed by authorities the next day, the girl identified Gary Hambright from a photo lineup and said that she had been driven to who she referred to as Mikey and Shambi's home by Gary. There, she said, at the couple's home, she was by Gary, Mikey, and Shambi in a room with black walls. She said that she had been photographed during this and videotaped. She also said that Gary and Mikey were dressed in women's clothes and that Shambi was dressed in man's clothes. To get a little more detailed with these accusations, it was later learned that the interview was conducted by an FBI agent on August 13th. The victim told the agent that, quote, "Mikey wears army clothes like my daddy's," and that Mikey put his into her mouth, bottom, and just like Mr. Gary. The victim also told FBI agent Foreman that she went with Mr. Gary to his house and Mikey and Shambi were there. The girl also told her mother that Mikey was the blood man because he had put blood on her and licked it off her body. Mrs. Adams Thompson also recalled that her daughter had described Mikey as having eyebrows that went up. It should be noted that Michael Aquino's appearance was distinctive. His eyebrows indeed did curl upwards in a very distinct sort of way. His hairline is marked by a prominent widow's peak, and his black hair was always worn combed straight back. When shown a photo of Aquino, the victim acknowledged that, yeah, that's him and that was his appearance. In addition to the identification at the Post Exchange, the young victim also identified Aquino out of a 5-person photo lineup and a video lineup. They had gotten multiple positive identifications of an alleged perpetrator. As it turned out, in documents released after this entire affair, it turned out that multiple children had apparently picked out Michael Aquino from a lineup and identified him as one of the The investigators, after hearing all these allegations from the young female victim, drove her to Leavenworth Street in San Francisco. The girl was asked to identify any of the houses she had been to before, and while she and the investigators were walking up the street, approaching the home where the had, according to the girl, supposedly happened, the young victim began to get visibly nervous and anxious and began clutching her mother's leg. When the group walked past 2430 Leavenworth, the girl immediately pointed her finger and identified the house as being the home where she met Mikey and Shambi, the house where she said she was videotaped and assaulted with the black walls. After a short search, it turned out that the exact house that she had identified on a random street in San Francisco belonged to Michael Aquino. A search warrant was then served on the Aquino home on August 14th. In attendance were agents from the FBI and the San Francisco police. Because the allegedly occurred on city property, it has to be a city case and not a military case, at least according to local government figures. And actually, I'm going to show you a clip. We actually visited Michael Aquino's former residence on Leavenworth Street in San Francisco when we were there filming this video. So it's very, very eerie. There's a very bad negative energy there. I'm just going to let you guys watch this and make up your mind. So right now we are at one of the most important locations in all of the Presidio story, 2430 Leavenworth Street here in San Francisco. Now, this residential property was once the home of Michael Aquino, the guy who was the mind control, mind warfare specialist. And this is actually where he founded the Temple of Set, which is kind of an offshoot of the Church of Satan, a Satanist organization dedicated to the occult. This is actually the location that the San Francisco police obtained a search warrant for and executed a search warrant on in the wake of these accusations being made against Michael Aquino. Now, it begs many questions. If there was nothing to these claims, then how was the San Francisco Police Department able to secure a search warrant for this property? How did any of that happen if there was no shred of credibility to any of these claims? And how did that young victim accurately describe the interior of this building if they've never been inside of it? Interestingly, when the police raided this home, they uncovered a bunch of stuff. They included video recording equipment, VHS tapes, photographs, all sorts of material. Nobody knows what was on that stuff. But yeah, it's interesting. It's eerie. Kind of an eerie looking property if you actually take a look at it. The old chandeliers. This is the Temple of Set, a satanic hotspot, and possibly a place where some of the worst things in the history of San Francisco happened. And it's been effectively covered up, which is crazy. Interesting that there's a shitload of security cameras out front too.
Is this still the church set?
I don't know. But I mean, anywhere that's got like a red door and black brick doesn't exactly look like home sweet home, happy-go-lucky Avenue. This is 2420.
So this is 2430, I guess.
Probably right here.
Yeah.
Because that's 2432. I think it's, yeah, there's a security camera there.
Crazy.
If only we could get inside and investigate. Ominous looking building. Yeah. All right. Let me see that. I was able to actually get a copy of the arrest warrant, which I'm not sure has ever been published before in a video like this, so I'm going to back all this stuff up with proof. As you can see in the search warrant, the officer writing all of this stuff down essentially relates the same information that I just told you to be true. The warrant discusses the victim identifying her at the PX store on the Presidio campus, and then goes into her allegations in detail. The girl had told investigators that she remembered a very distinctive bathtub inside of the home, along with a painted cross on the ceiling, a room with black walls, and more. And so the SFPD executed their warrant and made a move on Aquino and his wife. As you can see based on this warrant, the items seized from the Aquino's place included videotapes, cassette tapes, notebooks with names and addresses, 2 photo albums, 1 paper plate, and 2 plastic gloves from the kitchen garbage, 4 plastic cases of negatives, and 29 photos of costumes and masks. During the search, the FBI photographed the interior of the apartment, and some weapons, masks, and ceremonial items were observed there. And in a peculiar and somewhat troubling twist, it turned out that the 3 other apartments in the house and the house next door on Leavenworth Street weren't searched, although later investigation disclosed that Michael Aquino owned both properties. As far as I know, it was never revealed exactly what was found inside of those photo books or on those videotapes. And keep in mind, they found 36 videotapes in total. In addition, the photographs taken inside of the Aquino's residence were shown to the young female victim who had made the initial allegations on October 15, 1987. Although according to investigators, the victim's reactions to the photographs weren't fully conclusive, the pictures did show a number of items that corroborated her and other children's descriptions of the house where they were taken to and abused. Remember, the girl at first had said she was taken to this house with black walls and these people had these masks on. There were children talking about guns being pointed at them. This girl even described in her reports that she was placed into a bathtub with elephant feet, like very, very specific style of bathtub. It's in the reports, and she said that she was photographed in the while she was in this bathtub, and the investigators found a bathtub with elephant feet inside of the home, in addition to these masks, weapons, black walls, all of this stuff. This victim wasn't the only victim whose story was corroborated by the raid. You see, other children had testified about being taken to this same room, to this same house, and they had described seeing a number of different things. Masks, guns, toy animals or dinosaurs, a lion picture on the wall, and lions on the Egyptian throne, a computer, cameras, and a black room with soft walls and a robot. Every single one of those items that I just listed was named as existing inside of the apartment by a child victim before the raid was carried out. So how did all of these kids know what was in the apartment, know what it looked like, know these minute details if they'd never been there? In addition, one of the items seized by the SFPD during the search was a notebook. The notebook contained the name Mike Toto written inside of it. This was interesting because the Adams Thompson's daughter and another child victim had both mentioned Toto as being one of the persons and amongst the abuse that they were by while at Mr. Gary's house. During an April 7, 1987 interview with Major Hickey, months before the identification that the young female victim made at the PX store, the victim stated that Shamby and Sassy were the same person, and that Sassy was Toto's girlfriend. But before we go any further, we really need to do a dive into Michael Aquino.
In our investigation, we discovered that some of Satan's soldiers are also high-ranking officers in the United States military. Here at San Francisco's Presidio Army Base, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino led a double life as a satanic high priest. The colonel's cult is listed in the San Francisco telephone book, and his phone answering machine boasts of his affiliation.
This is the Temple of Set. The temple is the only international satanic religious institution fully recognized by the United States government.
Dr. Aquino, the high priest of the Church of Set.
Temple of Set.
Temple of Set, also a colonel, interestingly enough, in the United States Army. What is it, this Satanism?
I think that there is some confusion tonight because this same term means something different to Satanists than it does to Christians in the United States. By our own standards, the people who you've shown in these film clips would not be Satanists, either present or in the past. Rather, they would be the failures of a conventional religion.
I appreciate your opinion. What is it, sir, then? What is Satanism?
Well, originally the Church of Satan, when it was founded, was composed not of people with a hatred for Christianity, but of people who, by and large, were agnostics and atheists, because they felt that the institutions which had arisen around Christianity had failed in their moral commitment. So Satanism itself became an emphasis on rational self-interest and on taking responsibility for your own intellectual and ethical decisions.
Rational self-interest, you call it?
Yes.
With his widow's peak and arching eyebrows, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino looks more like Dracula than a high-ranking Army officer with top security clearance. He's the founder and high priest of a satanic church, which he named the Temple of Set. Aquino's wife Lilith, a woman with long dark hair, was a priestess in the temple's self-proclaimed Order of the Vampire. The couple had, many times in the past, referred to the search as a raid and had branded the investigation as a, quote, witch hunt. The Army has known about my religion for the last 18 years and has no problem, Aquino told the author of this original article in a telephone interview in late 1987. Not one single person in the US Army, with the exception of the chaplain, would have the remotest notion that I would be involved in anything like this, end quote. Indeed, when asked, Army spokesmen at the Pentagon have labeled Aquino's military career as extraordinary and say he's entitled to his religious beliefs. And that's true. No matter what religion you choose to follow here in the United States, it's enshrined in your rights as an American to be able to follow that religion. And as for Aquino's top security clearance, the Army spokesman stated that Aquino's openness about being a Satanist made him much less of a security risk than a, quote, and this is a direct quote from back then, homosexual or someone with drug or money problems would be, end quote. The Army didn't suspend Aquino's clearance when he joined the Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey in 1969, nor when they discovered that Aquino had founded his own satanic church in 1975, nor when Aquino, while on a NATO tour of Europe in 1982, performed a satanic occult ritual in the Westphalian castle that had been used as an occult sanctuary by Heinrich Himmler's SS elite in Germany. That's right, Michael Aquino performed an occult ritual in a witch castle in Germany on a trip that was funded by NATO, and the Army didn't bat an eye. And you could probably have seen this coming, the Army also failed to move to suspend Aquino's top security clearance during the sex abuse investigation. The nature of the investigation that prompted the search of his house, and I understand some of his belongings were taken by police, really is a question for the San Francisco Police Department. Major Greg Rickson, spokesman at the Pentagon, said when questioned about all of this, Michael Aquino, who eventually went to work as a programs analyst at the Army Reserve Personnel Center in St. Louis, vehemently denied up until his dying day had ever met or had the young victim in his house who alleged he abused her. He also unsuccessfully tried to have court-martial proceedings initiated against Adams Thompson, the parent of the child making the allegations. In a Temple of Set newsletter sent out 2 months after the search of his home, Aquino accused Adams Thompson, the victim's father, who's an assistant chaplain for the Army, of trumping up the allegations as some sort of Christian vendetta. Also relevant is his profession as a Christian clergyman. I certainly doubt he would have made such an outrageous accusation against any lieutenant colonel who was not known to be a prominent Satanist, end quote. In the course of my personal investigation, I was able to track down a copy of this exact newsletter, and in part it read, "What about Army Chaplain Lawrence Adams Thompson, blissfully enjoying his new assignment? in Hawaii after setting in motion this malicious damage to the Temple of Set, Lilith, and myself. I've requested the Presidio commander to initiate a formal reprimand as a permanent entry in Adams Thompson's file. This again is a way of addressing the matter that would accompany formal publicity. Basically, in this newsletter, Aquino tries to demand that he's innocent. He wants everybody to know that he's innocent. He says that since the victim's father was a Christian clergyman, that meant that he had a vendetta against Michael Aquino and wanted to ruin his life. So he tried to get his daughter to make up fake satanic assault allegations, and I mean, it's just a bunch of lies and falsehoods. He's just claiming that he's being attacked for being a Satanist when it couldn't be more opposite. This investigation was brought on because he was identified by children as an abuser. But like I said, if you want to read that full newsletter, which is interesting, which goes into much deeper detail on Aquino's personal thoughts on this whole thing, I'd recommend checking out the link I'm posting to it in the description of this video. In addition, later on when Aquino was lobbying for the army to take action against Adams Thompson, the young female victim's father, he stated in a court document that the man had, quote, mailed an obscene postcard to him, which was described in the documents as bearing, quote, a picture of a male transgender stating, blow it out your ass, you pompous jerk, end quote. But Aquino later withdrew the charge regarding the postcard after he learned that Adams Thompson and his family had already moved to Hawaii before the date the postcard was mailed. So he wasn't even in town to send the postcard, and Aquino had sworn under oath that this guy had sent this postcard to him and he knew it was true. In addition, during the time when Aquino was lobbying for the army to take action against Adams Thompson, investigators learned that he had lied to them multiple times under oath. Here's some specific wording from the actual filed court documents. Quote, based upon these sworn charges against CPT Adams Thompson and other statements made by plaintiff or Aquino as the investigation continued, CID investigated Aquino for false swearing. Specifically, Aquino falsely stated that the victim was 2 years old in October 1986 when she was in fact 3. Aquino admitted that he incorrectly stated the victim's age, but claimed it was a mistake. Aquino also stated that he had never used or been known by the nickname Mikey, but the children had claimed that he wanted to be called Mikey, that these other adults that were them referred to him as Mikey. And in addition to the children's identifications of Aquino as Mikey, Mr. Anton LaVey, a friend and associate of Michael Aquino, referred to him when he was being interviewed by investigators as Mikey. So it turns out very close friends of Michael Aquino called him Mikey, and he was lying, saying he's never gone by that nickname. Aquino also made other statements controverted by evidence, including that only 3 people had access to the security code to his upper apartment, which was false, and that he had never been to the CDC, which was proven to be false. So while he was lobbying for the truth to be told, it seemed as though Aquino himself was lying. Interesting, right? Well, interestingly enough, on May 15th, 1989, CID agents and legal advisors met with Lieutenant Colonel Craig Schwender, staff judge advocate for the Presidio, and viewed the investigation and evidence with him from the case against Michael Aquino. Schwender at the time openly stated to the group that there was probable cause to title LTC Aquino for the offenses of indecent acts with a child, conspiracy, kidnapping, and for false swearing or lying under oath. But for some reason, even though these powerful people in the military talked amongst each other and said that they probably could have charged him with things, the Army officials never followed up with this and never sought any charges. Then, in April 1988, Michael Aquino wrote a 4-page letter to the head of a children's advocates group in Southern California, warning that we do not intend to see a replay of what happened in Nazi Germany, when the reluctance of the Jews to challenge those who systematically and falsely accused Judaism of heinous crimes, including the sexual and ritual murder of Christian children, led to violence against them. Aquino said that the Temple of Set neither prescribes nor tolerates any form of harm, sexual or otherwise, to children or animals. It's made clear in our membership publications that should we have any reason to think that a member is engaged in any such activity, he or she will be immediately expelled and reported to the appropriate law enforcement or animal protection authorities. End quote. In a February appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show in the year 1988, Aquino said that Satanists are not servants of some god. We are our own gods. We are our decision makers, and people naturally fear this. Their beliefs, he said, are most closely aligned to that of Plato. To this day, neither Michael Aquino nor his wife were charged in connection with this case. The San Francisco police completed their investigation of the Aquinos in June of 1988 and submitted their findings to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. A decision on whether any charges would be filed was pending when this story first went to press but no charges were indeed ever filed. Aquino would eventually write a book titled Extreme Prejudice, talking about how he was completely innocent and how he and his wife felt like they were the subject of a witch hunt for Satanists at the time. However, according to some official documents filed, despite Aquino's contentions, this investigation was not a witch hunt. Aquino was not targeted because of his religious beliefs. In fact, as Aquino repeatedly points out in his voluminous submissions appended as part of the report of this investigation, the Army has been well aware of Aquino's religious beliefs throughout his Army career, and they have not interfered with his religious practices. The sole reasons for this investigation and the CID decision to title plaintiff are the facts that point to Aquino's abuse of the young Adams Thompson victim. In addition, this whole witch hunt narrative is kind of hard to buy into when you consider that the main accused, Gary Hambright, was himself a self-proclaimed Baptist minister. But although Aquino proclaimed his innocence, there were other members from within Aquino's satanic sect that wanted to go public with information about him, but never reached the exposure levels that they desired. For example, I personally did a lot of research to write this script and compile all of this information. Now let's take a look at this redacted report that I found online, otherwise known as U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, report number 0610-88CID-026-69259-5K3-6F3-6E2-6A15M2-5Y2DIMIS. Holy shit. It's a long name. In the report, on page 8, it is said that a former Temple of Set member recalled Michael Aquino mentioning a ritual chamber hidden in his apartment at 2420 Leavenworth Street. On page 32 in the report, it mentions how Michael Aquino used letters from General William Westmoreland and Senator George McGovern to defend himself from a 1972 controversy over his involvement in the Church of Satan. So, he was using government powers and powers that be to get himself out of trouble. On page 42, it's noted that Michael Aquino claimed in a letter to the Army that he had never come across any contemporary account of a Christian priest conducting a black mass, despite there being such an account in a book on the Church of Satan that Michael Aquino himself wrote. This shows that Michael Aquino was comfortable not telling the truth to the authorities or in official reports under oath. On page 47, the report notes that Michael Aquino's residence contained 4 different apartments. Remember, the police and authorities only searched one of those, including one that his Temple of Set leader brother-in-law lived in. Yet only the top flat was searched by the SFPD, and the apartment that was searched by the SFPD had randomly been repainted between June 1986 and January 1987. So right after or during the time when those initial allegations that children were being brought there, sometime in that exact area, the apartment where this is all taking place is randomly being repainted. Then on page 71, it's stated that when he was asked about the colors of his home's interior prior to the SFPD search, Michael Aquino refused to answer on the advice of his lawyer. It's also noted that despite heading to Washington, D.C. at the end of July 1986 to begin classes at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, Michael Aquino not only admitted to being back in San Francisco from September 19th to 21st and December 20th to January 4th, but he had calls from his residence on August 23rd, August 26th, September 4th, and December 8th. That's the exact time period of the initial allegations made by all of these victims. On page 84 are the notes of an interview with Anton LaVey, the leader and founder of the Church of Satan. Now, this is particularly interesting because in one passage, an interaction is described. Essentially, it's an anecdote about a woman who visited Michael Aquino at his home in Santa Barbara. The woman describes the incident, saying that at one point, Aquino began playing very loud music, then stepped out of the living room, then returned completely in the wearing only a creepy, demonic-looking mask. The woman stated she refused his advances on her and said that his conduct was unacceptable. In the search of Michael Aquino's apartment, a similar mask was recovered by investigators, corroborating the story. On pages 88 and 89 are the notes of interviews with Linda Blood, a former member of the Temple of Set. Now, while the former member states that she never saw children at any ritual, she also discusses some extremely inappropriate and graphic advances and behaviors that Michael Aquino exhibited towards her, basically exposing him as a freaky guy, if you get what I'm saying. On pages 90 and 91 are the notes of an interview with the former Temple of Set member who mentioned those rumors of Michael Aquino getting excited by activity, real freaky stuff. This ex-Temple of Set member also claimed that at one point Michael Aquino told him about a hidden ritual chamber in his apartment. He also notes that year 1 in the Temple of Set literature refers to 1966. On page 91 are the notes of an interview with somebody who visited the Aquino's property in April or May 1986 in his official capacity, and recalled that the front room had walls of a dark color, possibly black, which once again corroborated victim testimony. On page 91 are the notes of an interview with someone who installed a security system at the Aquino's property sometime in early 1986, and recalled a padded room on the upper level and dark rooms, once again corroborating the stories of these victim children. On page 114, it mentions the CID being contacted by a detective from the Mendocino County Sheriff's Department, who reported that a victim in a ritual abuse case they had worked had independently identified Michael Aquino as being a perpetrator. And the investigators noted that the prime suspect in their investigation lived very close nearby where Michael Aquino was currently assigned. It's pointed out that this prime suspect was a former U.S. Navy member. This serves to link multiple allegations of ritual abuse not only to Michael Aquino, but to the Presidio as a whole as well. On page 114, it mentions a probation officer at the Verdemont Boys Ranch in San Bernardino County, California, reporting that one of her probationers claimed his brother was involved with the Temple of Set in Lake Arrowhead, California, and claims that 2 suspects in a kidnapping trial in the area may have been linked to the group. And on pages 124 and 125, the entire section about whether Michael Aquino had contact with other suspects or victims mentioned in the report is completely redacted. The government has still to this day deemed that information too damning, too explosive to show off to us regular members of the public. Very interesting. The only time you redact a document is when you have something to hide. Make of that what you will.
Ted Gunnarsson, respected law enforcement professional, recently or retired now from the FBI, former regional director of Los Angeles. Do you, sir, believe that these dreadful allegations of babies being sacrificed are true?
I absolutely believe it, without any doubt, based on the information that's been given to me across the country by numerous survivors and by confidential sources and informants.
Then why didn't you name these people and arrest them? Never a name, never an arrest. These women come out of a group and they insist that they know the people in the group, and yet they do not identify these large, mysterious cults. Name them and arrest them and get them off the street.
Does he not make a valid point?
He makes a valid point. The problem with that is, number one, police officers don't believe it. I may believe it. You may believe it. Some people in your audience may believe it. They don't believe it. Number two, if you decide to investigate these people, you have to, number one, handle it from an undercover operation. If you put an undercover operation into effect, then you have, in a sense, your own police officers become involved in these heinous crimes, and they are, of course, become murderers. And in addition to that, if you do decide to investigate these people, there's a lot of work. And many law enforcement officers are apathetic and don't want to get involved.
But even with all this information, nothing came of this. And eventually, the Adams-Thompsons and their daughter found themselves moving out of the state of California to attempt to begin a new life. At the time that this original article was published, the Adams-Thompsons were stationed at a post in Hawaii and said that their daughter's nightmares and bedwetting had stopped. They also said that their daughter had not given up. She still believes that someday some judge will hear all the facts and do right by her. Michelle Adams-Thompson, her mother, said, "A lot of people were not as brave as her." But once again, if you think that that's the end of this story, it's not. At 4:45 a.m. on September 22nd, 1987, in the middle of this unfolding Presidio Day Care scandal, just over a month after the raid on Michael Aquino's Satanic Temple, and when all of this was reaching a fever pitch, a call came into the Presidio Fire Department. A building in the complex of structures at the Presidio that houses the daycare center was set on fire. By the time parents started dropping their children off at 7 a.m., the $500,000 fire had been extinguished. The Army Community Services building adjacent to the daycare center, which housed some of the daycare center's records, had been demolished by the flames. And perhaps, only coincidentally, maybe not, the fire occurred on the autumnal equinox, a major event on the Satanic calendar. An investigation of the fire by the Army blamed the blaze on a faulty wire outlet, but that was just conjecture. I personally haven't come across any documents or information where they stated how they made this determination, and in fact, You can barely find any information about this fire save for a single newspaper article and the original report that I'm adapting here for this episode. But think about that for a second. A suspicious fire in the middle of these investigations and search warrants and allegations, a fire in a building that houses tons of records. Who knows how top secret these records are, dealing with the child care center. Strange. But it seemed like the flames of hell were really heating up, because just 3 weeks later, fire struck again. This time at the daycare center itself. The fire was reported at 4:30 a.m. and it caused $50,000 in damages to a daycare center building that housed 4 classrooms, including Gary Hambright's. It also damaged and destroyed any future crime scene or evidence that could have possibly been investigated if the authorities actually would have ever acted on any of this. Now faced with 2 fires, at this point, the Army called in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms for help. And here's where things get interesting. This new group of expert investigators found that both fires, contrary to the Army's finding, had been caused by arson. They also found cinders under a different building, evidence of a third attempted but unsuccessful fire at the Child Development Center. The Army later offered a $5,000 reward for any information about the arsonists, but to this day, there were never any takers. And eventually, shortly after that last debilitating fire, right when all this stuff was heating up, in the middle of all these charges and swirling accusations, the building was demolished. So this wasn't after this whole thing finished up. This was in the middle of these investigations when people were all still coming forward and parents were in the media begging for help. The Child Daycare Center, Child Development Center burns to the ground. Now, that's pretty weird if you ask me. On September 30th, 1987, 8 days after the first fire and 6 months after the original charges had been dropped, Gary Hambright, the former Baptist minister and guy that all the allegations had been made against, was re-indicted on charges involving 10 children at the Presidio. He was charged with 10 counts of lewd and lascivious contact on a and 2 counts of The indictment included the Tobin's son, who started this whole thing, but didn't include the original charge of. That day, there was much backslapping at a press conference called by U.S. Attorney Joseph Rusinello to announce the charges. The press release said that the maximum penalty that might be imposed in this case is 96 years in prison and a $3 million fine. Surrounded by Army brass from the Presidio and several FBI agents, Rusinello said there would be no more arrests, that despite the children's allegations, there were no other suspects. Rusinello himself was an intelligence asset and a crooked guy, but we'll get to him later. He's done some really dark stuff in the past that we're also about to expose. But amidst all these events, even Gary Hambright, the main accused himself, appeared to suggest that others had been involved in the. At a press conference on October 2nd, after he was arraigned, Gary Hambright, reading from a prepared statement, said that he was innocent of all the charges and added, "I cannot understand why these allegations and falsehoods have been directed solely at me." This implies that there were others involved. This comment has never, though, to my knowledge, been followed up on. Jeff Hansen, the assistant federal public defender who represented Gary Hambright at the time, refused to allow his client to answer any questions, a policy unbroken throughout the long months after the indictment. No one was allowed to ask Gary anything. Jeff Hansen denied, however, that Gary was referring to anyone else. Do you think he was threatened after that initial statement into remaining silent? Could he have been silenced or paid a midnight visit by a high-level agent with a loaded weapon? God only knows. The parents of the victims at the time had many questions about the new indictment. Why only those 10 children, when there were dozens of total victims? Why only one child on the indictment who had medical evidence? Why did the indictment not include the children with such medical evidence, such as missing and lesions? And why were the charges so vague? Yes, you heard that correctly. Over the course of all these investigations, in addition to the Tobin's son who started this all off, other children had been physically examined for signs of abuse, and those signs were discovered. They included missing and lesions and tearing, but those kids weren't included in this indictment for some reason, even though they had made allegations against the same abuse. Rather than specifying the actual crimes allegedly committed on the children, 10 of the 12 charges were for committing lewd and lascivious acts. The other 2 charges, involving the Tobin's son and the boy who was abused on his birthday, were. In addition, Gary Hambright no longer was charged with the Tobin's son, even though he had been examined almost immediately after making those first allegations and was found to have had damage to his. The Tobin's son, the only child with medical evidence on the indictment, was included because he had been examined by CASARC, by a non-Army doctor off post. As it turned out, Cooperation between the Army and the U.S. Attorney had been very weak from the very beginning. Remember those 5 children that all tested positive for chlamydia, that all claimed that they had been abused by adults at the daycare center? Well, it was ruled that the cases of chlamydia could not be used as evidence because apparently the right kind of culture had not been taken at Letterman Army Medical Center. When one couple called the U.S. Attorney's office to ask if they should take their children for another culture, the answer was no. The reason for why they weren't allowed to retest their children for STDs in order to prove their allegations of abuse was never made clear. So they ruled it inadmissible, all these positive STD tests inadmissible because of a very specific technicality. Then when these concerned parents asked if they could, embrace that technicality and get their children retested, they just simply said no. Why? Assistant U.S. Attorney Peter Robinson, who had been brought in by then to assist Susan Gray, said those 10 children had been chosen from the more than 60 victims because they would make the best witnesses. They were basically saying that they believed 10 victims and that the other 50 plus victims could possibly have just been making it all up. In February, Assistant U.S. Attorney Gray, now teamed with Assistant U.S. Attorney Eb Luckel, asked the charges involving 4 of the children be dismissed because of problems with the children's testimony. It seemed like the cover-up was already up and running, and investigators were deliberately attempting to poke holes in the children's stories to destabilize and bring their testimonies into question. Later in the month, Judge Schwartzer dismissed all but one of the remaining counts because the charges were too vague. Gray and Robinson had submitted a 2-page document listing a series of dates on which the abuse allegedly occurred for each child, but did nothing further to spell out the accusations. This was in direct contrast to the testimony and information that it is publicly known that the authorities had. The testimony of feces parties, the allegations of hardcore ritualistic of weapons being pointed at young victims during assaults. They had all of this information, but the authorities had done everything in their power at this point to tear down this case before it could be prosecuted, and they'd done an excellent, expert job at that. The only remaining witness on the indictment, the Tobin's son, was also eventually removed from the case a short time later, on the advice of the boy's therapist. He claimed that he didn't want the young child to have to go through all of this again, and so they withdrew him from the case. And with that, Gary Hambright, the accused, was a free man again. He had now beaten 2 rounds of accusations that had ramped up into pending charges, and he was allowed to walk free. You see, the strategy for a simple case had failed once again. Gray, the daughter of a district court judge, was documented at the time to have never before handled a child case. This was her first, and she seemingly got anything and everything in the case wrong. The Presidio case, in fact, was believed to be the first such case of its kind handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco, and they butchered the entire thing from top to bottom. Gray had worked long and hard on the case, but confined her efforts to the law library. Neither Gray nor anyone else in the U.S. Attorney's Office saw the need at any point to hire experts on child abuse cases until about 2 months before the end of this entire affair. Yes, no one on any of these teams reached out to experts. No one tried to bring in other professionals who could help, who could analyze the children and the allegations. There had been a telephone consultation with Dr. Roland Summit, an associate clinical psychiatrist at Harbor UCLA Medical Center and a consultant in major sex abuse cases around the country, but that was it. He said, "I reviewed some early documents in the case. On the basis of the documents, they didn't want to go to court. There were too many allegations of weirdness and ritual without enough corroborating evidence. It is that kind of thing so far that is fatal to effective prosecution." End quote. Dr. Roland Summit, who was consulted on a number of ritual abuse cases, said that the failure in such cases is a scandal, that we have to see some sort of material proof to get any sincere concern to what 300 to 500 children have sworn in the midst of terror was real. If you had 300 adults in any circumstance, wherever they were assembled, who would describe the same phenomenon, nobody would want to believe it, but I don't think the justice system could possibly be that indifferent. The smart move for any attorney is to stay away from it and try to sneak through by selecting witnesses who don't talk about it. Are you going to put somebody in jail on the word of a little kid? He was quoted as saying. Failure to consult with abuse experts haunted the case from beginning to end. By the time the children had been in therapy long enough and felt comfortable enough to talk about some of the more bizarre aspects of the case, Prosecutor Gray was adamant that she could not take such things before a jury. "She sat right here on that couch and she said she couldn't take that before a jury," said one mother. Gray, in the wake of this affair, refuses to discuss the case. She stayed silent and, to my knowledge, personally, has never spoken about the Presidio affair again. It seems that everyone involved in these horrific events has been sworn to secrecy or threatened into silence. Gray's colleague, Assistant U.S. Attorney Luckel, said that the case fell apart at the end because, in the final analysis, when we reviewed the cases we had where there was a child who was prepared to go to court and was prepared to tell us what happened and describe something that actually occurred at the Presidio, as opposed to off base, there wasn't much to consider. According to Luckel, the U.S. Attorney's Office had decided that federal jurisdiction in the case ended at the boundaries of the Presidio. That meant that even though some of the allegations involved children being taken off post by Gary Hambright, they were not a part of the federal case. When we got right down to it, there were just a couple of possible cases where federal jurisdiction existed. Luckel said, "Our decision was that we could only prosecute for acts that occurred at the Presidio," which is stupid as hell and an easy way to cover stuff up. Since San Francisco police concentrated their efforts on investigating Michael Aquino, and essentially Michael Aquino alone, that meant that many of the children's allegations fell through the legal cracks. More than 60 children were sexually abused, and they almost admitted that that was true, but they just weren't abused at the right location, according to the prosecutors. So, is the Presidio case closed? We would not reopen it absent the discovery of new evidence, Luckel said. And this was in 1988. The statute of limitations for this case is 5 years. That means that the ability to prosecute this case essentially almost vanished in 1993. On April 19, 1988, the Army held an open house for a new $2.3 million daycare center at the Presidio campus. That same day, several parents held a press conference to protest the closing of the federal case. They refused to be silenced. "We feel that it's vitally important that parents everywhere realize these things really happen," the parents said in a prepared statement. "Cases such as this are being successfully prosecuted across the country at the state level. Why have Mr. Rusinello and the entire federal system failed to learn from these successes?" they said. Referring to the victims, the parents said, "All have made statements that they were abused. They have psychological evidence of abuse, and many have documented medical evidence of sexual abuse, including rape, sodomy, and venereal disease." But all their cries, all their pleas fell on deaf ears. The criminal case is closed. But by June of 1988, the parents of 23 children had filed $55 million in claims against the Army, the first step toward filing a civil suit against the government, alleging negligence that led to the abuse. Eventually, that number swelled to $74 million in claims, but nothing ever really came from it. There was no justice, there were no big payouts, there was no guilt admitted. In December of 1987, the Army reassigned several people connected with the case, including Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, the Director of Personnel and Community Activities, and John Gunnarsson, the Director of Child Development Services, responsible for supervising the day-to-day operations at the center. Diana Curl, the daycare center director who heard those first allegations, resigned. And in late June 1988, Gary Hambright was still trying to decide where he wanted to settle, and friends of his claimed he was in and out of San Francisco. In 1990, Gary Hambright died of AIDS. He never served a single day in prison for the of those children that he had allegedly participated in. Here's a newspaper article written by the same reporter, Linda Goldston, about Gary upon his death. A former civilian employee of the center, Gary apparently tried to keep his illness secret. When questioned by the Mercury News last spring, he denied he was ill and said, "I'm going to have to refer you to my attorneys on that." His death certificate, which was filed in Washington state, lists acquired immune deficiency syndrome as the cause of death. The time between onset of the disease and death was listed as years. It's not the first time that parents involved in the case have worried that their children may have been exposed to the AIDS virus. Shortly after the case broke, one boy's preliminary test came back positive, but further tests revealed that the child did not have the disease and the issue was dropped. Last spring, Army officials recommended that children be tested for the AIDS virus, citing a rumor that a suspect in the case had the disease. "We tested every kid that was brought in," said Presidio spokesman Bob Mahoney. "That was done worldwide because the victims and their families were all dispersed." Officials have said confidentiality laws prevent them from discussing either the number of children tested or the results of those tests. Mahoney said Thursday that it would be inappropriate to comment on Hambright's death. Jeff Hansen and Nancy Clarence, the federal public defenders who represented Hambright, said they both genuinely regret the news of Gary's death. "We're deeply sorry that he spent the last years of his life fighting baseless charges." Ugh. U.S. Attorney Joseph Rusinello made the decision not to prosecute the case in 1988 after a federal judge dismissed the second set of charges because they were too vague. Rusinello's decision later drew sharp criticism from a congressional subcommittee. He could not be reached Thursday for comment. In addition to the allegations of abuse at Presidio, 3 arson fires were set at the daycare center and 5 children were diagnosed with chlamydia, a transmitted disease. Since the case began, parents have accused authorities of attempting to cover up the allegations of abuse including the number of victims. Parents have maintained that more than 60 children were abused. One FBI document said as many as 102 children may have been victimized. The Army has refused to say how many cases were reported. The case that so many did not want to believe is still very much alive in the nightmares and acting out that continue for many children, in the jarring statements that come suddenly out of nowhere, such as the 4-year-old girl attached to the abuse case who sat at her kitchen table a few months ago and told her mother that she wanted to with a knife. Other children who claim they were abused now say that they hate themselves to their parents. One 6-year-old girl who was a victim was playing with modeling clay at school one day when she suddenly started stabbing it. "Mr. Gary is bad, and I'm bad because I let him do it," she told her teacher. "People keep telling us we've got to let it go, just forget about it and go on," said parent Gretchen Runyon. 2 of the Runyons' 4 daughters were among the victims. Both had confirmed cases of chlamydia. 3 weeks ago, our youngest daughter was having nightmares, and our other daughter was closing out the whole world, going to her room and sitting there with no radio, no TV, no nothing. Tell me it's over. And that is kind of really at the end of our Presidio story. This was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but I hope you guys can appreciate the level of detail that we went into this whole thing. So you can either view this whole thing as going one of 2 ways. Either the happened or it didn't happen. After taking in all this evidence that I've presented you with and listening to these stories, if you still don't believe that a single child was abused on the Presidio campus, then I simply just don't know what to tell you. There's so many things that just don't add up with the official story here. There's the fact that a victim picked out Michael Aquino and his wife on the street and identified them by name. There's the fact that multiple parents and employees witnessed on the campus of the Presidio, tried to raise an alarm about it, and were silenced. There's the fact that a man in a black hooded cape was seen by police officers running around the Presidio campus late at night with a little girl by their side. There's the weird cult graffiti, the melted candles, and the obvious signs of rituals that were taking place in the abandoned buildings on the Presidio campus. The victim who identified Michael Aquino's house while walking down the street. The search warrant that was executed on the Aquino's home that corroborated victims' stories. How exactly were these children able to identify very strange and distinct items and features inside of a home where they had supposedly never been before? There's also the case of the chlamydia, the allegations just in general from the children, the fire that completely destroyed the daycare center in the middle of the investigation, and all of the evidence, everything else that just didn't add up. All the statements from people saying don't look into this, the people saying this was never looked into, the people that were let go, let free, the charges that were dropped. I mean, all of that stuff is so crazy and so clear, and yet, according to the official story, the story that the government would tell you today, not one single child was at the Presidio during this affair. But there were still other people involved in these cases that had yet to share their stories, people that would speak publicly about these events. For example, there's an interview with a woman named Cynthia Angel, a local lawyer in the area at the time, who was interviewed in the book Children for the Devil by Tim Tate. Here's an excerpt of her interview. She said, "That January in 1988, I became involved in a civil lawsuit. I represented a man who was fighting his ex-wife for custody of his children, a 5-year-old boy and his 3-year-old sister. Sometime into the proceedings, the children showed evidence that they had been sexually abused. The little girl, in particular, showed medical signs that were consistent with an object being forced inside her. She had 2 lacerations inside her, and the pediatrician said there was no possibility of them being self-inflicted since they would have caused extreme pain. Her brothers showed strong psychological signs of a severe traumatization, and it gradually emerged in counseling that both had been ritually abused. They started describing horrendous acts that they had been forced to take part in. They had sex with animals. They described being forced to drink blood. They also talked about witnessing people being killed and having their blood drained from them. The children had been at the Presidio Day Care Center, and so I began asking about the facility there. I was vaguely aware that there had been allegations of ritual abuse at the center, but I couldn't be sure that the abuse these children described to their therapist actually took place there. The kids said a man named Michael Aquino was present and involved in the ceremonies they had been forced to attend. They told their mother this, and since I had made enquiries about the Presidio and come up with the name of Michael Aquino, I asked the mother to confirm the details. She refused, and so I was left having to call as a witness when the case went to trial. When the case went to trial, the person who had reported the disclosure in the first place. Simultaneously, I made formal enquiries about issuing a subpoena to get Michael Aquino in court and on the stand. I have no way of knowing if he was genuinely involved in the abuse. I do know, however, that the children were in the Presidio Day Care Center and identified someone who appeared to be him. The case was due to go to start on February 1st, 1989. The night before that first hearing, I got a telephone call from a woman who was going to be a key witness. She asked me to meet her at a restaurant on the main street here in Red Bluff because she had some important information for me. I agreed, got in my car, and drove downtown. When I got to the restaurant, she wasn't there, but before I could even get out of the car, two men got in through the passenger side. One pointed a gun at my head and told me to drive out of town. I was made to drive about 4 miles out of town, and at that point, I was blindfolded and put into a second car and driven somewhere else. During the course of this kidnapping, which lasted about 3 hours in total, I was told that I was investigating things that I shouldn't be investigating, and that if I continued with it, I would be killed. During this kidnapping, Cynthia alleged that she was shown photographs and videos that were meant to threaten her into keeping silent. She stated, the picture was of its skin had been partially peeled away, and the men made it clear that the child had been killed in a satanic ritual. The tape seemed to back this up. It contained children's voices, children crying, and adults chanting. The chanting was not articulate. I couldn't tell you what they said, but the men made it clear that this was a satanic ritual and that I should stop investigating Satanism if I wanted to stay alive. They also said that if I told anyone what I saw that night, or if I reported the kidnapping to the authorities, they would surely kill me. I was terrified, of course, but I felt I had to report it, and I had to carry on with the case. The kidnapping was reported in local news outlets at the time, but nothing ever came out of it. In fact, here's another newspaper report detailing the search for the kidnappers. A reward of $10,000 is offered for the arrest and conviction of a man who allegedly abducted a Red Bluff attorney at gunpoint in a child custody case that may be linked to Satanism and ritualistic. That's the only motive we can see, Red Bluff Detective Ted Wiley said today of the February 2nd kidnapping of Cynthia Angel. Mrs. Angel and her husband, Anthony Edwards, also an attorney, are offering the reward. The man allegedly threatened Miss Angel's life several times if she continued to investigate links between a Tehama County child custody case and a San Francisco Bay Area children's day school. The man told Miss Angel that she was investigating something that she couldn't and showed her a photograph of a baby whose skin had been partially removed, Wiley said. It looked like it could have been an autopsy photo, but the man said it was a child who had been killed during a satanic ritual. Mrs. Angel told police. Neither Miss Angel nor Red Bluff Police Detective Ted Wiley would disclose further details of the child custody case today. However, Wiley said a composite drawing and description of the man who allegedly kidnapped Mrs. Angel resembles a man reportedly involved in a case in which a child or doll was seen from a signpost on Kirkwood Road near Corning on July 29, 1987. In that case, a man who identified himself as a police officer told a concerned citizen that everything was under control, while another man and woman removed the child or doll from the signpost. Very bizarre. So this is me breaking out of the article. Another case of weird shit. People, concerned citizens saw from a signpost, like a street sign, what looked like either a dead little child or a baby doll from that signpost. And when they went up to try to figure out what was happening, someone identified themselves as a police officer, and a man and woman were seen removing the thing from the signpost. Really weird. Police artist Marjorie Casebeer initially noticed similarities between suspects in the two cases as she was drawing the man Miss Angel described. Tehama County Sheriff's Captain Alan Groves said today there are some dissimilarities between the two composite drawings, but would not rule out that the two suspects could be the same man. The case is definitely still open, Groves said. On February 2nd, on a satanic holiday called Candlemas, Miss Angel arranged to meet a potential witness at a Red Bluff restaurant for lunch. When she arrived at the restaurant, a man she did not recognize entered her car, pulled a pistol, and ordered her to drive to Derryville. And you know the rest of what happened. So that's insane. But it still gets weirder. It appears to this day individuals connected to the Presidio case are still afraid to speak out. For example, citing his article, Do What Thou Wilt, Satanism in the Temple of Set, from September-October 1995 in the Haight-Ashbury Free Press, reporter David Hoffman claimed the following about a man who seemed to be Glenn Pamfloff, an infamous detective in San Francisco. Quote, as recently as 1995, the SFPD detective in charge, who I interviewed, was still too frightened to reveal details of the case. End quote. And this silence has carried on to the present day. In fact, in 2017, some independent journalists attempted to gather any information that they could about the Presidio scandal by filing a Freedom of Information Act request, a request which should have allowed them access to the files and documents because, according to the authorities, the case is closed. However, this was the response they were given. Quote, The SFPD replied to your public records request on October 11th, 2017 via GovQA, the SFPD's public records portal. You were notified that the case you are inquiring into is open at this time, and that any records are exempted from release under California Government Code Section 6254F. On February 15, 2017, you contacted legal assistant Elsa Campos to inquire into the SFPD's denial to release any records to you pertaining to the investigation of child abuse at the Presidio Child Development Center during the 1980s. Ms. Campos advised you that she must consult with her superiors before providing you with any further information. Please be advised that although this case is currently closed/inactive, it can potentially be reopened in the future if other victims come forward. Therefore, the SFPD cannot jeopardize any potential future investigation by releasing case information. During your conversation with Ms. Campos, you also inquired into the fact that the statute of limitations for the case has expired, and therefore, case information should be releasable. Please note that the statute of limitations is 5 years from the time the sexual assault is reported to the authorities. So, for those victims that have not come forward, they still have the right to absolute privacy. Furthermore, the SFPD has ultimately determined that the information you requested will not be released to you because the case you're inquiring into involves the alleged sexual assault of juvenile victims, and information cannot be released without a court order. Very strange, right? I thought that nothing happened there. Very, very bizarre. It's a very ingenious defense for them. When you say, oh, this case could be open in the future, it's closed right now. Like we said, nothing happened, but just in case one of these victims ever comes back, we can't share any information with you, just in case. Oh, and you're talking about the statute of limitations? Well, here's a little loophole. And also, on top of all that stuff, it's a juvenile claim, so we're just not going to share it with you. There's also this excerpt from the book Painted Black by Carl Raschke, which discusses the Presidio case. Those particular charges were later dropped against Aquino and his associate. Parents of the children who were allegedly said it was because of strong pressure from the Army on the federal investigators and the San Francisco police. Prosecutors blamed the well-known difficulties of prosecuting child abuse cases in the first place. But just before this book went to press, however, authoritative sources within the military who requested anonymity reported that another investigation of Aquino had been opened by civilian law enforcement in California. In addition, in the same book, the author posits 22 families filed $66 million in personal injury claims against the Army in connection with the Presidio case. Although charges against Aquino were dismissed, Gary Hambright, who was arraigned in the case, pleaded innocent and suggested he might be taking the rap for others possibly involved in the alleged. After long legal maneuvering and bickering between Army and federal investigators and the San Francisco police, the case against Hambright was shelved as well. So, at the end of the day, what do you make of this? Do you believe that Michael Aquino was an innocent man? He died in 2020. Which direction do you think he was sent to? Do you believe that there really wasn't a single child at the Presidio, as these official documents claim? There are just so many questions here that remain unanswered, questions that I've already gone over with y'all. So at the end of the day, I personally know that those children were abused. I tend to believe victims, and I've been trying to use my platform here to advocate for not only the rights of children, but for truth and transparency in the government. Because no matter what political party you're in, no matter what political party you're affiliated with, we're not talking about politics at this point. What we're talking about is these Epstein-level bastards that are trafficking children, that are allegedly at these different things, engaging in rituals and dark magic and evil stuff. These leaders that might seem Christian on the outside, but behind closed doors are like taking part in allegedly the murders of children and the desecration of innocents. That's horrific stuff. And I don't care what political party you're affiliated with. It's not just one party that's engaged in this sort of activity, it's both of them. I don't know if anything will ever be revealed from the Presidio case, because truly, Google it yourself. There's no real Wikipedia page or anything about the Presidio affair. And on top of that, it's just officially been declared a hoax. I've talked to people about it who have said, that's so fake. It's just devil worshippers, satanic panic. I've thought about that many times. I used to buy completely into the satanic panic thing where it was none of those cases were real and they were all just manufactured. But I think that the satanic panic was manufactured so that most of these cases that are ridiculous, they happen And then when you actually point out these real cases that have real victims like the Presidio that had these direct ties to these occult beliefs, then you just get lumped in with the satanic people trying to make Satanists look bad. It's just like everybody in this world. There's good people in every group and there's terrible people in every group. But yeah, be sure to comment what you thought of this documentary in the comment section. Please share this out. Like this video. This took a lot of work. Yeah, we're diving headfirst into another investigation next week that is absolutely crazy. And yeah, thanks for watching. Stay safe, everybody, and stay spooky. I love you guys. Thank you.